This one's going around the x-axis. It specifically tells you to use shells. In the future, you will have a choice. You can use shells, you can use washers, whatever presents itself as the better choice, and we'll talk about how to do that later. But for now, today, we're looking at shells. So if it's going around the x-axis, remember shells are parallel, so the rectangle has to be parallel to the x-axis, which means we're going to have a dy cut. So that means everything's going to be in terms of y when we set up our equation. And there's three things that we need to look for. We're going to have the average radius, the height, and the thickness. So the nice thing is, like I said earlier, the thickness is always going to be either dx or dy, depending on what cut it is. So we already know one of the three. The thickness is going to be dy. Everything else is going to be in terms of y. Now, this is where it's going to start to be very important to kind of draw the picture and see what kind of shape do I get here. Again, we know we're doing shells today, but in the near future, we're going to have the option, and we are going to need to figure out what kind of shape is this. So here's our rectangle. It's getting rotated around the x-axis. So if we draw this, we end up with a shell. Right? And our height of the shell is going to be right here. So if we look on the graph, that's our height. The average radius is right here. And we already know the thickness is dy. Well, average radius, that's a vertical distance, right? We're going from the x-axis up to the graph. That vertical distance is going to be the y value of the graph. Well, since it's a dy cut, that's all we need for our average radius. It's just going to be y. It's a nice thing about shells. If we're going around the x-axis or y-axis, doing a basic one like that, our average radius is always going to be either x or y, depending on what cut we have. When we get into doing this around like a different axis, like x equals -1 or x equals 5 or something like that, then it gets a little trickier. We have to take that value minus a number, or the x-axis or the axis revolution minus the graph. But for right now, today, it's going to be pretty basic. If our thickness is dy, the average radius is going to be y. The height here is a horizontal distance. It's really the x value of this curve. The distance from the y-axis to here is just the x value of the curve. But since we're doing this in a dy cut, we need to represent x as a value in terms of y. So we're going to have to solve this equation for y. I'm sorry, solve it for x, so it's in terms of y. So we're going to take the square root of both sides. We get positive or negative square root of y equals x minus 2. And then add 2 to both sides. Well, really, that gives us two equations. We need to figure out which one of these is the one that we're dealing with. Is it 2 plus square root of y or 2 minus square root of y? So if you think about this, when we graph these, it graphs each half of the parabola. Right? If we were, when we were doing it like with y equals and the square roots, we get half of a sideways parabola. This is kind of the same way with a regular parabola. So 2 plus square root of y, which half is that going to be? The right side, right? The positive side would normally be to the right. So this is 2 plus square root of y. This other half over here is 2 minus square root of y. Right? So we're dealing with the 2 minus square root of y part. That's going to be our height. So we have the three parts for our definite integral. We're going to put the 2 pi on the outside. Average radius is y. Height is 2 minus square root of y. And the thickness is dy. We just need to figure out our upper and lower limit. So we're doing those in terms of y also. What's our smallest y value? 0. To find our biggest y value, we need to figure out where does this graph have a y-intercept. Well, that's going to happen when x is 0, so all we have to do is put 0 into the equation. And basically, we're trying to figure out when these two intersect. So we can put 0 in for x. So we get 0 minus 2 squared. That's going to be 4.